Yeah, we're live now.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the meeting of the Corporate Overview and Scrutiny Committee on the 21st of January. I'll just, in saying welcome to everyone, just remind everyone that this meeting is being both live streamed and recorded, so that our residents can see us at work and the things that we discussed this evening. First of all, I will take apologies for absence. As I understand it, we've had an apology from Councillor Churchman, and I believe Councillor Rigby is substituting tonight. And I can see that we have all other councillors online. Second, I'll move to minutes. And as one of the items on the minutes was with regard to the executive scrutiny protocol, Lucy, would you mind updating the committee just on the progress of that item now that it's moved from this committee meeting through to Cabinet?
Yeah, so I just thought I'd give a quick update because obviously last time you looked at it was in November. So I went to Cabinet in December and got approved there. And since then, as Dem Services, we've been working to start implementing the review. Obviously, some of those recommendations are easier than others, but we're working now on kind of a plan on how that's going to be implemented and how we're going to move forward. And we can present updates, further on as it moves forward. Most of them obviously won't come in until the beginning of the new municipal year, but we'll keep the committee updated as it progresses.
Thanks very much, Lucy. It would be really good to hear an update on that as it comes through. Are there any other comments on the minutes this evening? No. Thank you. Are we happy then to approve the minutes of the previous meeting?
Yeah, agreed.
Thank you. I'll take those as agreed. We'll move on then to items of urgent business as item 3, and I've not agreed to the consideration of any items of urgent business this evening. We'll move on then to item number 4, declarations of interest. Would any member like to declare any interests? Okay, I have no members indicating. Thank you very much. We'll move on then to the substantive items for the evening. And if I could just remind members that if you want to speak on an item, if you could use the raise hand functionality just to let me know that you want to speak. And if I've missed anyone, please do just shout before I reach the end of the item, just to make sure we do get you included. And I will make sure we've got time just to go around all members in the committee if there is anything that you want to ask. So item 5 then is a verbal update on the communication strategy, and I think Karen Wheeler is going to talk us through that one.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening. I wanted to provide an update on the development of the new communication strategy and outline a timetable for bringing that forward to the committee. As previously mentioned, a previous meeting, we invited the Local Government Association to come in again to do a peer review health check of our communications function and the way that the council communicates. That took place in October, and we received the final report and feedback from that process in the middle of December. The LGA, the peer team, interviewed councillors across party, partners, staff and the local media, and have provided a number of recommendations for us to consider going forward, including some that are particularly relevant to the development of the communication strategy. And one example of that is doing a who reads what survey. So understanding better where our residents and how they're getting the information. So is it the resident newsletter? Is it the council social media channels? But how much of it is actually from other information sources and from the local media itself to really help us inform taking that strategy forward. So at the moment, we obviously, I'm sure you appreciate the communications team are quite busy. We're reviewing the recommendations and developing an action plan in response to that review. And we'd like to bring both the LGA's report and that action plan back to Corporate Overview and Scrutiny in March to get the committee's input to that before it's finalised, but also to again inform the development of the communication strategy, which we'd like to bring back to the committee in full and in the first meeting in the new municipal year, so in June. So hopefully that sets out for members what we've been doing to date, and the work that we're considering and the timetable for bringing that forward, and hopefully a useful update.
Thanks a lot, Karen. I think that certainly makes sense to me. I'd certainly support the Who Reads What survey activity. I think that'd be valuable information. And so, as I understand it, then in March, we'll take the output of that LGA peer review and an update on the progress with the strategy, and then we'll recommend, I guess, in the work programme this evening that we take that full strategy item into the June meeting in the next municipal year, and that the makeup of the committee, whoever it is, can consider that at that stage. Brilliant, thank you. Had Councillor Haigh indicating to come in on this one?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Thanks, Karen. That was helpful as a sort of interim update on where we are. Could you just remind us a little bit about what the council is doing today regarding social media strategy? Because obviously a lot of the forums, etc., particularly Chafford 100, they're really active on Facebook and Twitter, etc. I just wonder how engaged the council is in some of that sort of chat that's going on.
Oh, did you want to come back, Karen, on that?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, we obviously use our own social media channels, and we encourage the forums not just to share that information, but also to provide updates and information via other routes. I know many of them have email distribution lists, as well as their own Facebook groups, where we can comment directly and provide information and responses on other social media groups. We do. Obviously, some of those are closed and we're not able to do that, but we have worked really hard to ensure that we provide as much information as possible directly to the forum chairs, so that they're able to push that out through the most appropriate channels for them. And I'm sure that will be reflected in the comm strategy going forward as well.
Thanks, Karen. Councillor Rice.
Yes, Chair. Karen, I suppose it could talk about communications. Local elections. We've seen today yet another record of deaths, etc., and infections. Are they still going ahead, or are they now being adjourned for a further period later in the year?
Do any officers want to attempt to tackle that one? Sean is bravely volunteering to prognosticate on what might happen.
I was waiting for Karen to jump in, but I could see she was waiting for me. I mean, everything we've got at the moment, Councillor Rice says they're still going ahead. There's been no decision to move them, albeit there's been quite a lot of conversation in the press.
Yes.
We're looking at all of the processes and working with the Electoral Commission and so on, as well, as you would expect, about how to try and deliver a safe election.
Yes.
It's not just the polling stations. Obviously, that's obviously the biggest area for members of the public. But we've also, all of you at some point have been in the count centre as well, and seen how close everybody gets in there as well. So we're working through processes to try and manage to deliver a safe an election as we possibly can, and we will continue to do so until something changes in terms of guidance, should that happen. But at the moment, it's full steam ahead, booking polling stations, booking count centres and the like.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Councillor Haigh, did you want to come in again?
Yeah, just picking up, very good point from Gerard, just picking it up really. What in terms of communications, I assume we get as many postal votes into the mix as possible. That's going to help in terms of reducing contact. So what's the council's thinking around campaigns around, encouraging more postal voting?
We're currently going out at the moment as part of the whole register of elector aspect anyway, the electoral registration process. Part of that, people will be reminded that they can actually take postal votes and apply for postal votes should they wish. So, yeah, it's certainly an avenue that we're making public.
Thanks, Sean. I think Councillor Rice and Councillor Haigh make sort of really important points there. And I guess as we go out with that communication, if we can really emphasise the fact that there is that opportunity available to residents to make sure that they do have a more secure option of participating despite COVID. That is available. And I think, while I personally would very much want to see the elections go ahead, I think it's very important that residents do have that confidence that they can take part and not be excluded by anything that's taking place. I think that is very important. So I thank the councillors for raising that this evening. Are there any other questions for Karen on the communication strategy? No. Okay. Thank you very much for that update, Karen. And feel free to leave the meeting at that point if you'd like to step out.
Thank you. Thanks.
Cheers. So we'll go on then to item number 6, the draft general fund budget and medium-term financial strategy update at page 17 on the agendas. And I think Sean is going to take us through this one.
Thank you, Chair. So this actually largely builds on previous reports that the committee's considered over recent months. Just starting briefly on the current financial year, the last report we took to Cabinet as an update at month 6 showed we were forecasting a £2.7 million deficit. I'd remind everybody that we started with the year with a £4 million surplus, so that's pretty well a £7 million turnaround, despite the support that we've received from central government. Since then, we have been notified of additional funding, which should bring us pretty well in on even by the end of the financial year. So there is no call on reserves as it is, but we have then lost the budgeted surplus, and that does have a knock-on into future years. So looking ahead, this is the draft budget. We've been reporting quite regularly, and this is still the case, that there was a £34 million budget gap over 3 years, and 19 million of that relates to 21-22, and so by definition 15 million related to the following 2 years. Pressures as to why we have those budget gaps. I've just said that we've lost the surplus that would have been brought forward into this year. There are also now collection fund deficits, and we've touched on those in recent meetings. Collection fund deficits, sorry for people, are the fact that we're not collecting as much council tax and business rates as we would normally expect. And the way local authority accounting works is that any losses on there against what you expect and you budget for impact on future years. So they don't impact on this year. So again, any reductions, that is an expenditure item, if you like, for next year. There are social care impacts, quite considerable, in both children's and adults. We've just received the latest indications from adults, again, which is a national review, which shows us as being in the lowest quartile. But I think by definition, that also means that where there are increased pressures and around costs within those services, within the providers, then that has a greater impact. And so rather than it just being growth because of demographic growth next year, which is a normal annual increase for that budget, you've also got resilience payments going out as well. So that's built into the MTFS too. And then there are other increases in there around inflation, pay awards and increments and so on. And there are increases in the Treasury budget for increased MRP to fund the capital programme and then related interest costs. So they're the reasons why we have pressures. What we agreed and we reported previously to a committee was because of the size of the problem next year for 19 million, we were going to take a number of one-off approaches to buy the council time to consider how to balance its budget more thoughtfully, shall we say, in a more considered approach and timescales going forward. So I'll touch on what some of those are in a minute, Chair. Spending review was announced in November by the Chancellor, and the important thing to note there is a 1-year settlement, and I'll come back to there again. And by that, I mean we've only been informed of resources available to us for the next financial year, for 2021-22. Our detail that we got in terms of exactly how much grant we would get and exactly what can happen with council tax, etc., came out a week before Christmas. So we've been analysing those figures, and that's what's now been built into the MTFS and this particular report. So how do we balance next year? We do, this report does set out a balanced budget for next year, but there are obviously a number of assumptions within there. The first one is vacant posts. We did report on this throughout recent months as well. We know that there will be employee reductions over the life of this medium-term financial strategy, but if we are to plan them, the approach we've taken so far is to put a freeze on any what's considered non-essential recruitment. So some recruitment, especially in social care, is still taking place, but a number of other areas, and especially permanent, is very much restricted. And those vacant posts we are budgeting to save in the region of about £4 million. The impact, though, of that is it means there are unplanned reductions in staffing in various different services, because you have to take a vacant post where a vacant post is, and therefore there could well be service impacts, which obviously officers will try and mitigate as much as we possibly can. Again, another one which is employee related, just to get those through at the moment, is the allowances. So the council's allowances, this is could be shift work, it could be levels of overtime, it could be car allowances and what they call business user allowances. There are a whole wide range, many more types of allowances. Now, what members may recall is in the last 2 years, we carried out quite a considerable review and restructure of all of the council's pay grades to modernise them and to bring them into line with better working practices. And by doing that, it was affordable at the time. A considerable amount of additional funding was put into the employee budget line. But as part of that agreement, there was also an agreement to reduce down the level of allowances that are paid, to actually offset some of that increase that had gone into the employee line. So what you're seeing now in terms of the £800,000, which is in the budget report, is the outcome of that. It's actually netting off against a lot of the additional funding that's already taken place. But of course, it is a very sensitive issue for many people, obviously, and I understand that. The council tax is obviously probably one of the more controversial aspects in all of this as well, in terms of how it affects wider people. The general council tax, the annual amount of council tax you can do has stayed at 2%. It can't be any higher. So we normally come in at 1.99%. Cabinet have recommended that. And I know it's probably going to be a question going on in future years. We've also assumed 1.99% council tax increases. But for next year as well, the government have now announced recognising the problems within adult social care. And I've already touched on the fact that we're putting more growth into social care, both adults and children's, than we normally would do in a year, are allowing councils to raise up to an additional 3% as an adult social care precept. And again, the Cabinet are recommending that we take that 3%. So in total, that is a 4.99% council tax increase. Other ways of balancing the budget that we've worked through, the announcement that we received just before Christmas also allowed a £4.8 million grant, COVID-related grant, again going into next year to support. So the government recognising that the impacts of COVID would be continuing into the next financial year. But of course, that is a one-off. That is there specifically for dealing with COVID. So we're all going to hope that's a one-off and won't be required again into the future. The final two aspects of balancing that budget is the use of capital receipts. We've touched on that before as well. We had intended to use it for MRP purposes. We can't do that anymore. So we are looking at where we can capitalise other aspects of annual expenditure, which includes transformation, which is part of the allowance that government provided 2 to 3 years ago as a relaxation of the rules around capital receipts. So we've reduced down the amount we were going to do. It had originally been 5 million. We've reduced that down to 3 million to recognise what we can now use it for. And then finally, we've used reserves because we've managed to increase reserves in more recent years. And so the balancing item is using £3.3 million worth of reserves to balance off next year. Again, that is a one-off. So that's a very quick run through of 21-22, Chair. I think I just need to move on now to 22-23 and 23-24. So the following 2 years of the MTFS. I opened up my introduction by reminding people that we had £34 million, and over those 2 particular years, it was £15 million. Actually, the MTFS now shows the deficit over those 2 years as being £25 million. And that's because by taking a one-off approach in a number of areas in this coming financial year, we're pushing the problem further down the line. So that's why that's now up to 25 and not 15. Okay, that's the impact of using one-offs. That has already got savings built in. So it's got a number of departmental savings. They're summarised on the face of the MTFS. One of the larger ones is certainly within the environment section, where Cabinet have previously agreed a move to fortnightly collection in 22-23. So that's an example. But there are other general savings coming through. So there are more staffing savings in there, for instance. Now, the assumption is, I've mentioned that there is £4 million worth of vacant post savings this year. The assumption is that £4 million will be turned into permanent reductions in 22-23. And then in 23-24, we will look for at least another £2 million worth of reductions. And I say at least because even by achieving that, then we've still got that £25 million budget gap. So there is considerable work to do in reviewing all of the council services, how we do things, what is affordable and what we can manage to do. And that also obviously includes trying to realise more income through commercial sales and commercial processes. And I've already mentioned, I think, that we're looking at 2% per annum council tax going forward, because there has been no announcement about any additional adult social care, for instance, precept. The difficulty, I made a point of mentioning 1 year funding settlement earlier, and that becomes the difficulty for 22-23. They are looking at possibly another 3-year spending review in this current financial year, the current calendar year in 2021. But that will not be announced at the earliest until probably mid to end of November. And the impact on Thurrock Council will not be known again until probably the week before Christmas. And the reason why those dates are important is when you look at the size of the challenge of the budget that we need to save for 22-23, everything requires, things of that size require considerable levels of consultation periods, notice periods, and the like. And if we were to wait until December to see exactly how much our problem really is, that's too late to actually then create a balanced budget for 22-23. So we are going to have to look in the first half of this calendar year and start bringing forward the ideas to the relevant overview and scrutiny committees as quickly as we can about that approach so that we can actually start implementation. Chair, I think that's all I wanted to say on this particular report, but obviously happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Sean. Clearly a very, very sobering report for us to read as councillors, and clearly huge issues for the council to tackle over the coming 3 years. I think if I start with a number of questions that I have, and then I'll open up to the committee to ask further questions as well, and I think we'll keep moving through it in that way. If I could start at Appendix 1 on the medium-term financial strategy, I think that's probably the easiest place to start to understand the broader picture. Again, I think you've spelled out the kind of the key points there, but quite stark. Certainly that before intervention, a budget deficit of £42 million over the next 3 years, and one that's coming not just from COVID impact, but also from a wide range of other areas. Sean, so first of all, I guess in starting this off, in terms of understanding the breadth of that deficit, I'm reading this table as saying we are seeing some 6.4 million or so pounds impact from COVID pressures, out of a total of 42 million, which is approximately some 15%. So we're saying that kind of COVID pressures are around about 15% of that overall 42 million. Is that a fair comment?
Yes, I think so, Chair.
Yeah. So I guess the kind of the key point here is COVID is clearly a severe pressure, but there are also kind of very, very large pressures on the council from a number of other areas. If I could just sort of work through this table, Sean. So first of all, starting with those COVID pressures, we've got just over £3 million of corporate growth in for 2021-22. I wonder if you could sort of summarise what that means in terms of activity for the council. Clearly, that's there's both COVID and non-COVID corporate growth, and that continues into 22-23 and 23-24. So, what kind of increases are we looking at there, and what does that represent in terms of council activity?
I'm glad you raised the following 2 financial years, really, Chair, because that is the normal level of growth we would have been putting in if you go back through previous MTFSs. So all of that funding, practically all of that funding that's you just identified, for be it COVID or non-COVID, all links to both adult and children's social care. That's the only growth that's actually being put in for those 2 services at this time.
Thanks, Sean. So if I understand that correctly, then though, what that means is even where we've kind of got the COVID line for corporate growth, we if you like, we don't kind of back out of that in future years. That goes into the base, and we continue to use that sort of resource going forward.
More than likely, because what that's actually paying for is new fees that are being paid out. Now, I mentioned earlier that we are very much one of the lowest in the country in terms of benchmarking activities. So this is actually going to start increasing the overall levels of payments out, as well as meeting growth in terms of overall numbers of people being supported.
Thanks. And I think I heard you correctly, sort of to move on to council tax, that the assumptions here are that we presume that, first of all, we raise by 4.99% in the coming financial year, and then assume that we're capped at 1.99% in the following 2 financial years, and that we take that full amount of council tax increase.
That's correct, Chair.
Thank you very much. So clearly quite considerable increases for residents here, and we're talking about nearly 10% or so over the 3-year period. If we sort of follow that thought through, and one of the other things that the report spells out on the council tax position is the negative impact of being able to collect council tax. Do we foresee that kind of reversing out of the budget again over that 3-year MTFS, or is that something that we kind of assume stays in for that period?
No, we're assuming that our rates will start going back up. But certainly more so from 22-23. We recognise there are still going to be serious difficulties in 21-22, but I think, like everybody, hoping we're coming back to some form of normality in the following year.
Thanks, Sean. Something that we've talked about a lot in this committee, I think, is commercial income. And looking at the MTFS, it doesn't feel like there's very much growth baked in for commercial income. We've kind of discussed this before. We've talked about the difference between what's a target and what's kind of banked and baked into the MTFS. But I guess the question is here: should we be more ambitious in terms of the income that we're targeting through commercial income over the following 2 or 3 years?
We will be, Chair. If I just explain that line that's on the MTFS under commercial income, they're not targets on there. What you actually see is that the 1,089,000 that's in for next year is actually a reduction in fees and charges. and that's carrying forward from the reductions that we've seen in this year. So we're recognising that it's going to take quite a while still for people to come back to normality. You know, we consider the theatre, you consider Grange Waters, town centre parking, all of those things, trade waste, you know, etc. So we've reduced down the level of income that we believe we're going to get next year. And what you then see further across into 22-23 is that level being put back. So if you just looked at that line, that's not actually suggesting we're targeting any additional income, that we're just getting back to where we were. However, two other lines that I would put you in, that I would direct you to really. Where are we? Just below that, in the next section, there is a line called Savings Departmental. Now, these are savings that have already been put forward from various departments. And I need to use savings in a wider sense. It's not just reducing expenditure, but it's increasing income. So it's a mix. There is a mix in that line of reduced expenditure and increased income. So first of all, there is additional income through there. But secondly, when I go down to the £25 million budget gap that remains for those 2 years, that needs to be closed through reducing net expenditure. And that's done through two different routes as well. One is reducing expenditure, and the other is actually increasing income. So we haven't set any targets against that 25 million yet about how that's split. We haven't gone through a top slice approach yet, giving directorates targets at this stage, where people would come forward with their own views. We're working through that corporately at the moment to try and identify those ways, but it will be a mix of both.
Thanks very much, Sean. I guess finally, to finish from my questions on the MTFS, it's kind of quite clear here that the impact of COVID, our estimate of 6.4 million or so, we clearly haven't had the funding from government to close that gap. Are there any kind of further representations that we have made or will be making to government to seek additional funding to make sure that we're reimbursed? I know, you know, a lot of council workers working incredibly hard to deal with the COVID situation and to make sure that we look after our residents as much as possible. It feels, you know, unfair in those circumstances that government isn't stepping up to the plate and making sure that those costs are reimbursed.
So the government have done a number of things in terms of the general grants that have been given in this financial year and the 4.8 million that they've shown, you know, within this particular settlement as well. They are carrying forward the ability to claim up to 75% of any lost fees and charges up until June. That they've announced up until June at the moment as well. Having said that, you know, we're still doing monthly reporting back to MHCLG on all of the various pressures that we have, just like every other council in the country is doing, and pointing out the need for additional support. If you go through, I'm sure, the networks for adult social care, children's social care, they're all doing exactly the same as well. So there are representations certainly coming through from us and nationally across a number of different streams about the, you know, about the pressures on finances that have come from this.
Thanks, Sean. That's useful. So I'm going to ask a couple more questions on the general report, then I'm going to give a couple of other members a chance to jump in and ask some questions as well. But if we go next to page 19, I think there's a very useful chart at the top of that page which summarises the council's core funding sources and the core expenditure. And in my very kind of simple explanation of that, anytime that bar chart of funding sources goes above the red line of expenditure, then we're in surplus, and any time that it falls short, then we're essentially in deficit. So I think that's a really helpful view to have, and clearly, you know, the challenge there is across the years from 2021, we have to close that gap either by increasing income or cutting back on expenditure. I guess the question, though, more widely is this: if you look at that chart, we've increased that expenditure pretty much every year through the course of the period that we're looking at here. So actually, the challenge, I guess, is should we have been far more aggressive at cutting our cloth according to our means, reining in the spending that the council had, so that we didn't end up with this kind of shock to the system when one of the income streams drops out. Is there a challenge that we maybe should have been much more aggressive in challenging that expenditure?
I don't know whether aggressive is the right word, Chair, but I think in hindsight you can always look at these things and say we should have absolutely been challenging our expenditure more and reducing down, and using any surpluses that we had for more one-off expenditure. I can agree with that now. Certainly, I could also make the other statement that we should have carried on maximising council tax increases every year that we've had as well. Because we still remain one of the lowest in the country for all unitary authorities. If we had an average council tax of all other unitaries, we would have another £13 million worth of income every year. But I appreciate your comments earlier on council tax that that's what the residents therefore have to be able to pay, and I recognise the challenge of that. But simply, yes, the basis had always been that we would continue reviewing services, and we have been. Have we done that in hindsight now quickly enough? No, but nobody was really expecting this position to be here.
Thanks, Sean. I think I'm going to ask some members to come in at this point. So I think Councillor Rice has been indicating for some time, so I'll call him first.
Thank you, Chair. Sean, with the advent of a £30 million overspend on the A13, can you tell us the revenue consequences of that? And also the brown bins, we were told there was going to be a charge. Can you remind us what the charge is and when that will come in?
I'll do the second one first. Charging for brown bins has not been agreed. So there is no charge for it. There is no time scale, and it's not built into these figures. In terms of the £30 million on the A13, I can't say it is going to be 30 million at this stage. As we've said, we're still constantly reviewing and challenging figures, and we are still looking for alternative methods of financing. The easiest thing to say, though, Councillor Rice, as a rule of thumb, an infrastructure project has a 40-year life. So MRP, minimum revenue provision, this is the amount of principal repayment, if you like, is paid back over 40 years, and it is therefore 1/40th of the sum. So for £10 million, for instance, that is £250,000 per annum. And then on top of that, you've also got interest on the £10 million as well, which at the moment is in the region of about 0.7–0.8%.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor. Thank you, Sean. We've got Councillor Ralph.
Yeah, thank you for that, Sean. Sean, could you go over the drop in the interest receivable area? On the chart on page 19, obviously it was pushing above onto surplus, and now obviously that oil inflation that's been kindly put there is dropping down and dramatically dropping down on 23–24. Can you just run through that for me?
Again, we've been reporting this through the last few meetings of both Cabinet and overview and scrutiny, and in standards and audit, that there is a pause to the investment strategy. I think for the use of pause, when it actually comes to investments, you can say stop. That we are not carrying out any further investments going forward. So whereas we had targets in future years to actually achieve new investment income, we've now removed those. So that doesn't now come forward as one of the options to close that gap of 25 million. In addition, any investments that mature over the time of this period will not be replaced, and so there is a natural reduction as well, as opposed to the growth that we've been receiving. Number of reasons for that. Obviously, there's been quite a lot of publicity about the council, and that certainly has an impact. But equally, government has given a very clear direction, which is opposite to a previous direction, which was to become more entrepreneurial and do these things, which is very much a case of we should stay away from investments now. And one of the restrictions that's been put in place is around what they call the Public Works Loans Board, which is the ability for local authorities to go and borrow from the PWLB when it needs to. We've mainly used short-term borrowing, but as previously reported to this committee in Standards and Audit, we've now had to go to PWLB more often. But you cannot go to change. There were changes to the rules in November, which mean you cannot go to the PWLB if you are going to be carrying out further investments into the future.
Thank you, Sean.
Thanks, Sean. Councillor Rigby.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Yes, just regarding the savings that you're looking at making on non-essential recruitment cutback. With existing employees, will you be looking at pay freezes over the next few years?
It's certainly one of the things that we are looking at and will be discussed with the unions. You'll be aware that the Chancellor, in his announcements last year in November, actually announced a public sector pay freeze, except for the lower paid workers at £250 per lower paid worker up to that was up to a certain grade. Thurrock Council and all councils actually do not fall under that criteria. We are not governed by the government's pay policy, but we obviously have to have mind to that in terms of that direction and the overall affordability as well. So we do carry out independent reviews. We will be looking to actually reduce down the level of pay award. Certainly, I would imagine that the position will be to come forward at the £250 for the lower paid workers. But as I say, this is still very early stages with discussions with the unions. At the moment, the pay award is built into the medium-term financial strategy to a certain level. So there would be savings should the lower, should we pay in line with, say, the Chancellor's statement.
Thank you, Sean. Councillor Duffin.
Thank you. It's very much to thank Sean for his report and everything. I think it was 3 questions, and the chair asked every single one of them. So most of it was around just commercialisation, and obviously the investments aren't continuing based on everything that's happened, but to make sure everything that can be done around other commercialisation is taken. Just because, there is always more revenue streams, and any time we can bring in revenue from commercial rather than through council tax and other taxation is obviously great for everyone involved in the council and for our local residents. So no, just a massive thank you to you and your team.
Thank you, Councillor Duffin.
Thank you, Councillor. Sean, if there's no other councillors indicating this time, then I've got a few more that I'll plough on with, and if there are any other councillors wanting to come in with, I'll defer to them as we go as well. One of the things I wanted to pick up was at 3.8 in terms of specific proposals for savings coming from various directorates, and clearly we've only got one directorate here that's coming forward with specific proposals, and then obviously council-wide proposals alongside that. Are we happy with the speed at which we're moving to those proposals? I mean, I think we take the point that there's the use of the reserves to cover us in year to give us the time to make those more comprehensive. But are you kind of satisfied that we're moving quickly enough, whether within year or over the next year, to get to that kind of significant savings level that we need?
Chair, I'll never be satisfied at the speed we can make savings. No, I think we made a conscious decision to go to try and take our time, not rush into making reductions straight away, with this short-term measure. And of course, at the time, nobody had any idea about how COVID would react as the year went on and actually get worse rather than better, and the like, and so on as well. So a lot of those savings that are put forward from environment, highways and counter fraud are actually ones that have come about as opposed to forced. So it's not as if we forced one service into actually savings and not others. Other services have made savings. These were just more notable coming through. And of course, all the other services, as well as environment and fraud, a little bit, will be certainly challenged with the vacant post savings more so than environment and fraud will be.
Thanks, Sean. I want to go back again then to the investment strategy, and I think I welcome your comments that pause is probably not the right word for this. I think it's clear we've kind of completely abandoned that now as an approach for the council going forwards. If we look at kind of therefore what the council's strategic options are going forwards, and we've talked in the past about the need for kind of a plan A, plan B, other alternatives bring in. Does this mean that now kind of plan A, B and C is continued maximum council tax rises and the need to kind of slash services pretty heavily to make those savings? Is there anything else on the horizon that we are kind of actively exploring to kind of offset some of those requirements?
I think the majority of the things we're doing, and it's part of the use of capital receipts, is very much focusing on how we can change things through transformation. Our objective will always be where we have to reduce expenditure to try and reduce down the impacts on residents and the wider community. That's got to be the objective. Having said that, I will go back again to the level of council tax we have, and it's been one of the things I've said many times. We've always talked since I started here back in 2009 about having the lowest council tax in Essex, but actually you're not really comparing like with like there. So we come down to the unitary treasurer, unitary authorities in the country. We are in the, I forget exactly where we are now. We're in the bottom 5 of the amount of council tax that we raise in terms of the lowest, in terms of the level of council tax. And by definition, what we do is we fall into a category of low cost for the services that we provide. I mentioned earlier adult social care. It was either earlier today or yesterday that I received, I think it was yesterday actually, the latest benchmarking activity showing that we are very much in the bottom quartile of costs in the country. When you get that, you've then got to look and say, well, where are the savings? Where are the big savings that can actually be made when by definition your services are already low cost? And there will be areas which people will point to, but when we're talking about a deficit of £25 million, then that becomes really challenging. So when we look at income, you've rightly raised, and Councillor Duffin raised it as well, around commercial income. But you look at any form of commercial income now and say, well, how much could that really achieve? We earn something like £8 million, for instance, in fees and charges to the community. If you put that up 10%, first of all, there'd be uproar, but that only gets you £800,000. And we're looking at a deficit of 25 million. So there is going to have to be significant reductions in the amount of buildings that we have, how better to deliver. You've heard the administration talk about fewer buildings, better services. So challenges around how we do that to try and reduce down those costs. We are looking our biggest budget by far, and I think I did present this to, or at least announce this to this committee a few months ago. Our biggest budget by far is staff. We've only got something like 12 budgets in excess of £1 million overall. When you sort of group through categories, I don't mean that's refuse collection, that's that. If you look through categories of spend, employees is the highest. Second highest is the money we spend on adult social care, which by definition, as I've said, is actually one of the cheapest in the country. The next highest is children's social care. And this isn't the staffing, actually, that I'm talking about, because that was in the high bit. This is the actual placement costs that we've got. You've then got things within that dozen as well, such as concessionary fares. Well, that's a national scheme. There's nothing we can do about that. We have to continue paying that. And there are others in terms of, say, the interest that we pay on debt. Yes, that's high, but actually we are still paying. What we're not looking at is the income line, which says that actually if I reduce down all the interest we're paying on debt, I lose even more in income if we were to redeem all of those early, but actually redeeming a lot of our investments isn't in our hands. So there is a significant challenge, Chair, around how we are going to balance this budget going forward. And it isn't going to be one thing. It is going to be needing to increase council tax. It is going to be having to try and increase our commercial income in whatever way we can and look for new schemes. It is going to be through staffing reductions as well. And it is going to be through overall service reductions. So it's going to be a mix of everything. This figure is too challenging, for us to try and pinpoint any particular areas.
Thanks, Sean. I just want to sort of have one last question then in terms of the kind of the overall budget approach. Do you think it was in hindsight, do you think it was a mistake for the council then to put all of its eggs in one basket in terms of that investment strategy? Should we have been much more cautious in how we applied that? Or if we had the time again, would we be sort of going down the same path?
It's I mean, we could be here for hours on this conversation, Chair. I mean, there's a number of questions to be answered there, isn't there? If by having that investment income, we've managed to maintain services to all of our residents for an additional period of years, and increase services, and have been able to reduce down their council tax, was that ever a bad decision? Even with all of the difficulties we faced in recent months about our investment approach, you can still look at it and say, okay, I understand people's views of investments, but that has brought additional funding into the borough, which has benefited residents. It has also benefited the council's financial position in terms of its strength and its resilience, which has obviously helped now. Now, what it did do was take the pressure off, and it's what you sort of referred to earlier, Chair, take the pressure off actually making reductions in the services at a faster speed than we have been and that we're now going to have to. If we go back to pre-investment strategy, we were constantly forecasting, £10 million a year, £30 million over 3-year deficits. Right. Without that, we would have already been making the reductions we're going to have to make in the next 3 years. We would have been doing that 3 or 4 years ago, and we would have still had to be doing it now. Because the other side of it is, and this is what we're now going to have to plan for, Chair. This 25 million, we have still got surpluses from the investment strategy in there of £30 million plus. Now, over the next 7-8 years, they're all going to disappear. So we're not just looking at that 25 million, we're looking at how we're going to do that. Now, what we've done is we've deferred those decisions and impacts on services in the community, for a few years by doing it. So, I can look at your question in a number of different ways. I can answer it in a number of different ways. But I don't think there's any right or wrong answer. The view a little while ago, from both locally, from nationally, and from politicians was actually going out and doing investments is not a bad thing. That has changed now. For whatever reason, that has changed now, and that's where we are. So was it a poor decision at the time? No, I don't think it was. I think it has benefited the council. I think it's benefited the residents, and we've moved from a position of having £8 million worth of reserves that can be used for this position back in 2016 to £24 million worth of similar reserves, at March 31st, 2020. And there have been other benefits, linked into that. But do I wish that we made more progress in the last few years in reducing down the council's base budget. As I sit here now, I would have to say yes.
Thanks, Sean. That's a very, very kind of comprehensive response there. Appreciate that. I think a few more hands have come up, so I think I'll give members a chance to come in again. So if I start with Councillor Rice, I think you were first again.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Sean, Impulse Leisure, that's our leisure trust. Obviously, they haven't been operating through this period. What's the call on our budgets for that?
Thank you, Councillor Rice. There's no call on the council's budgets for that. The council does not have any service agreements with Impulse Leisure to deliver services. So we have fallen outside of most of the definitions that have come forward in being able to support them. And because we don't have that sort of agreement, there would also be state aid issues as well. More recently, though, the government put out a different form of grant that Impulse Leisure can access, which actually meets the criteria of the relationship between Thurrock Council and Impulse Leisure. It requires the council to support that bid, and the council has supported that bid, and the bid has gone in.
Well, that's encouraging, because obviously, if that wasn't the case, Sean, I'm sure they'd be after us with some emergency funding of some description, whether we've got agreements or not, because ultimately we couldn't let them fail.
I think that's the real difficulty, Councillor Rice, that we've had to look at in more recent months, which is there is a serious state aid issue for us, and actually Impulse Leisure, because of the nature of the lease and that agreement, which is not to actually provide services on our behalf, means that they are a tenant like we have tenants in the community organisations or businesses in any of our other premises. And that creates a different difficulty, that not just in terms of state aid rules, but if we were going to provide that tenant support, why wouldn't we be providing all of the other support as well? You get to that area of affordability. What we can now say is that the government have now acknowledged that position, as I say, and that bid has now gone in with the council support.
Good. Thank you very much, Sean.
Thanks, Sean. Move along to Councillor Ralph.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I just want to go back over the interest received. I mean, Chair, I don't want to sort of be pedantic, but if you took out the investments that we've done, and you see how bad we would have been in the next 2 years. So you're questioning what we've done in the past. I mean, you can see how it's going to fall dramatically in the position it's going to be. So, would you, as you say, use of hindsight, should we have done anything different? Well, I mean, it's lucky we didn't, because the gap there shows that it's sort of supported, and we've had those reserves there to help us through periods. So I think the investment plan at the time was correct. I think it's a shame that the directive has changed, because, you know, I think investments would be moaning if we'd done investment it was bringing in billions of pounds. I don't think we would. You know, we're lucky that we haven't invested in things like shopping centres and shopping malls and shopping complexes that have got a long-term downtrend of being used. And I think when you look over everything, with the increase of council tax and what we've been through with COVID, no one see that coming either. So I know, as a resident myself who doesn't have a mass income or nothing like that, of course I'm going to be affected by increased council tax. But at the same time, I know the struggles that we've been through as a country, and to not expect the council tax not to increase would be really short-sighted. We have to come up with the funds to pay for things that have happened in the last few months, and with the new trend of how we have to manage our interests, it's going to drop down. So making that gap of that 25 million, I do think looking at more capital ways we can get more capital money in and stuff like that, it's got to be a necessary thing. You know, looking at the commercial side, there's got to be more elements there that can open doors to us. We have got stuff that's going on in the borough that could generate income in the next few years, but it's going to think we don't know how long COVID is going to last. And at the moment, I'm not saying it's a rate of survival, but I don't think our council as a whole will be in a bad place compared to others through our foresight of having these investments in place at the first time?
Thank you, Councillor Ralph. Councillor Haigh.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Councillor Ralph kind of picked up my point there. I'm coming back to the investment strategy. I think it's been generally supported through this committee and throughout the council, and has been, I think, overall has been a positive thing. I think it's unfortunate that there have been some reckless investments by some councils, obviously that's influenced government policy in that area, and also there's been some siren voices locally that have almost shot ourselves in the foot, really, with some local commentators. Obviously, that's influenced direction in terms of what government is allowing in terms of investments. I think it's been a positive thing overall, and unfortunately, a few bad apples have spoilt things, really. But just looking ahead, I'm not sure Sean's dived off. I'll wait a second till he comes back because it's for him the question.
Should we just, Councillor Duffin, do you want to just put your point? Was it a point or was it a question as well? If it's a point, we can take that now while we're waiting for Sean. Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
I took my hand down rather than unmuting myself. So, yeah, basically the point was, if we're just looking at the graph, that 2018-19 year followed by the next 4 to 5 years in total, you're looking at over 100 million in investments across those 5 years. Obviously, it might be slightly different either way because I'm judging it based on lines of the graph. But basically, the question earlier was, do we regret pumping 100 million into Thurrock? And I think at no point can the answer ever be no to that question. Obviously, yeah, if we look at the rest of the spending, it basically levels out at 120. And yeah, that's the direction we need to go from, either, as Sean said, raising council tax, or sort of alluded to yourself, making cuts, on how we get to that end result. But any time you can bring in over 100 million over 5 years, that's a massive achievement by Sean and the team, and something that, yeah, I've put on record time and time again that I would have loved to be able to continue and even build on that money, because that's money we can bring into the borough, and really our residents are the one that feels the biggest benefit from it.
Thank you, Councillor. Sean, I think Councillor Haigh was just going to ask a question of you before we move on as well.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Obviously, sorry, carry on, Sean. Are you finished?
I was just apologising. I went off to get some water. That's fine.
No, that's all right. Yeah, that's fine. No, I just wanted to, obviously, you know, we do know it's there's a hell of a challenge in front of the council now in terms of bridging this funding gap, and you obviously mentioned all sorts of avenues that are being looked at. I just wondered, obviously, there's not many positives around COVID, but one of them is we've really learned we can actually operate quite efficiently remotely in many areas. And I think that's going to impact on perhaps some of the staffing opportunities within the council. But I'm just wondering as well, in terms of coming back to the sort of shared service agenda with other councils, obviously a few areas we managed to get shared service agreements in place that work quite well. Other areas we've explored, they haven't worked so well because for geographic reasons, whatever. But I just wonder now whether this kind of working remotely opportunity gives us another chance to revisit shared working with other councils, because clearly we're looking at a different sort of way of working now, and there may be areas we can explore. You mentioned staffing is the biggest line item pretty much in the council's revenue budget. So if we can actually find ways of working more efficiently, sharing services with other councils and authorities, this could be an opportunity to go back on some of those areas where it hasn't worked out in the past for a range of reasons, because we're now looking at a new way of working. I just wonder if that's being looked at in any depth, really.
Yes, it has been and it will be. Nothing. What I can say is there is nothing off the table in terms of how we can do this. You know, through be it automation, be it working with other partners. Actually, you know, you mentioned you know, how COVID has made us aware of what can actually be done as well. The impact that's come from the community throughout COVID and so on as well, and the services that they can actually provide, you know, again is there, and should more of our services be provided through the community with support, you know, all of those are questions, you know, and the first one is going to have to be, actually, should the council be doing it? And actually, if it is a service that needs to be provided, is the council the right one to actually be doing it in isolation, or should it be another body, or should it be done in partnership? But you're absolutely right, Councillor Haig. All of those things will be considered, and nothing off the table.
Thanks very much, Sean. One last thing, Sean, from me. I think I spotted in there that we are only seeing an increase in revenue support grant of, I had it around 80,000. So very, very kind of small increases in general support from the government. I'd bracket that with an earlier question I asked, and again, are we kind of trying to make the case that local government is supported properly through some of these challenges that we're having at the moment?
Yeah, I think, like I say, there has been huge amount of support from the government. If you're going to ask me, would I want more? Of course I would. But actually, there has been significant support that's come through. If you look at RSG, sorry, the Revenue Support Grant, that has actually been the grant that's been reduced year on year. So actually, any increase a standstill would have been a benefit compared to previous years. I guess when you look at that, that's where I'd need to take you to the bottom of that medium-term financial strategy, which shows the £4.8 million COVID grant coming in. And there has also been, I didn't mention it earlier, but additional social care grant as well that can be used for both adults and children's social care. So there has been quite considerable support. I think, you were also asking about Plan A, Plan Bs, but I'll make one other comment, which is taking it from a different direction. I think everybody has known actually for quite some time, and I'm talking successive, there's no politics in this, it's successive governments from different parties have known that local authority is actually quite broken. And the biggest thing that they see with that is adult social care. How many times have papers come forward to change the way adult social care is funded, for instance? And that has got to be one of the massive questions that's come out from COVID now, because it has absolutely demonstrated that if it wasn't a breaking point before, it is now. So again, that becomes certainly part of that overall challenge, I think.
Thanks, Sean. Councillor Ralph.
Yeah, just quickly, Sean. Obviously, as the council, we gave out a lot of grants to businesses while they shut. If those shops were found to be maybe all working during that period of time and also claimed that money, if that money was claimed back, would that come back to us or would it go to the government directly?
No, that would go back to the government.
Okay, thank you, Sean.
Great, thanks. Are there any other questions that members wanted to put on this item? No, thank you. So the recommendations at 1.1 and 1.2 were that we comment on both the council tax level and the draft budget. I think just to pull out a couple of comments in particular. So I've sought to comment on the increased support from government from both the COVID costs and general RSG that I think would be helpful to continue to pursue. I think a number of councillors have made the point around continuing to look for commercial opportunities and other transformative savings to reduce the council tax pressures on residents and the need for kind of severe service cuts going forwards. And I think we've also had the call there for looking at things like remote working, other approaches as well, to more radically approach some of the service delivery that we have to try and look for both savings and better ways of doing things. And I'll totally echo any of those. Are there any other kind of comments that people would sort of wish to call out particularly to just to note down as the summary?
I suppose, Chair, the only other thing, I know we're going to touch on capital in a minute, but the only other thing is to be selling off some of our assets, which at the moment are leased, where presumably we could actually make some money out of them.
Thanks, Councillor Rice. And I suspect that you've anticipated some of the conversation to come, but Sean, I'll just bring you in on this one.
I was actually just going to take my hand down again in case you wanted me to do it under capital. But yeah, Councillor Rice is right. We are there's two aspects of disposing of the assets. Well, two financial aspects. Let's say that there are a number of other reasons why you would do. The first one is that we are using capital receipts, as I explained earlier, to pay for certain transformation activity, but also actually disposing of the of assets creates capital receipts, which can also be used to fund the capital programme. So, you know, Councillor Rice mentioned the A13 earlier. If I use capital receipts to actually pay off any of that overspend, then that doesn't create any revenue consequences going forward. So there's a number of reasons of how you can use those capital receipts. Secondly, I mentioned earlier about 12 generic type budget categories over £1 million. Well, one of them is the cost to us of our various buildings. You know, when you consider utilities, you consider business rates, basic repairs and maintenance, and so on as well. And so by actually reducing down the overall operational estate, that obviously creates running savings in running expenses as well. So that's another way it can support the revenue programme. So very much coming forward with disposals. There will be a paper coming to Cabinet in February with 8 or 9 disposals on there. But there will be more coming in throughout the year. Again, the other benefits, Chair, sorry, I said there were other non-financial benefits. Obviously, if it supports businesses, house building, etc. in the borough as well, there are those other more tangible benefits.
Yeah, thanks very much, Councillor Rice and Sean, for that. And there was actually one sort of final point that I forgot to raise earlier. I mean, clearly, sort of the point that I made generally on council tax, and I think the one that we need to consider is that the huge impact on residents of something like a 10% rise in council tax over the next 10 years. Clearly, anything that we can do to try and not get to that point would be really kind of important. But I think I forgot to raise earlier at 4.4 on the local council tax scheme. One of the things that we've discussed through this committee is how that scheme is reviewed and the kind of the ongoing consultation. And Sean, I think the proposal here is that scheme is continued as is for the following year to consult on. I guess the thing that I would want to just make sure and check on there is that we haven't kind of dropped that consultation. We will come to it. It's just maybe slightly further out than we'd expected.
Yeah, absolutely, Chair. That's absolutely correct. I did apologise to the Chair earlier because I should have made the committee aware of it. So just to bring everybody up to speed, the committee a few months ago did receive a report on local council tax scheme, and we were going to go out to consultation at that stage. When we started looking at a number of different things, be it the questions that would actually be in that consultation, be it how we would let's stay with the questions for a minute. When you consider the level of uncertainty that people have got at the moment in their own personal lives with job prospects going forward, with the furlough scheme and other support that was being given directly to LCTS claimants as well by the government, it didn't seem the appropriate time to go through because the whole economy around LCTS was very confused. Equally, the ability to carry out a meaningful consultation at this stage as well with COVID and those uncertainties didn't seem that plausible. So officers with the portfolio holder for finance agreed that it wasn't the right time to go out of consultation, that we would maintain the current scheme, which gives more certainty and clarity to everybody going forward, but we will go forward. The aim now will be to go back out during the summer of this calendar year for consultation when hopefully things are an awful lot clearer. You'll get a report to council in January, which that's already gone out, hasn't it? The council agenda, I think. Has the council agenda gone out? Must have done. Yeah, so there is a report on the council agenda for LCTS. It's basically maintaining the current scheme. It shows that our budget of going into LCTS to support claimants. So this actually in part, but only in part, Chair, I recognise that, answers your concerns about increasing council tax for those most vulnerable. There is an additional £700,000 budgeted to support people through the LCTS scheme as well. So yeah, quite a lot going on, but that's where we are on that. But yes, we will go back out to consultation on the LCTS.
Thanks, Sean, and appreciate the kind of the detail on that. I think if no one else wants to come in at this point, then I think we can move to the recommendations. And are we all happy that we've made the relevant kind of comments on the item this evening? Yeah, thank you. I'll take that as agreed. Thank you very much. So we'll move on to the next item, which is the capital strategy. And I think Sean will be taking us through this one as well.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, members. So the capital strategy sets out the approach to capital borrowing in the main over the coming year. It actually sets out some of the prudential indicators, and members of this who have been on this committee for some time will remember that some of the indicators were misleading, if nothing else, and they have now been removed, thankfully, over the last couple of years. That was a national direction, and it actually sets out the capital and treasury management projections. This report has probably been more, it has had probably a higher focus on it in the last couple of years, because this is where we would have set out targets for further investments in the past, and we would have built that into our borrowing projections. So members will all recall items in the press several months ago about how the council was going to borrow £2 billion, for instance. This is the report that would have come from. As a future projection, it would have allowed the council to go up to £2 billion worth of borrowing. If you've looked through the figures within this report now, you know that we don't go anywhere near that figure, that the figures now are very much based on the existing capital programme, and as and when investments which are outside the time period, or the larger investments, should we say, are outside the time period of this report, that's when you'll see those borrowing requirements come down as those investments are repaid and reflected in the indicators. 3.3, paragraph 3.3 just points out two different things to members. This is no different this year than to previous years. It asks members to remember that we have been taking out temporary borrowing since 2010, but there is potential exposure to interest rate changes and availability of funding. I did report at a previous overview and scrutiny committee and at standards and audit that there has been some impact on our ability to borrow from other local authorities, which is why we've now moved to PWLB, for some of that borrowing, but rates have actually still stayed, but including within the PWLB, actually considerably lower. And the second aspect is around the minimum revenue provision. This is an annual requirement. We haven't looked to change it. This is as it's been now for the last 2, 3, 4 years. The minimum revenue provision, if you look at private sector, it would be the equivalent of depreciation. It's the amount we must set aside, for the future repayment of debt. The way it works practically isn't actually to repay debt, but by building up the amount, by collecting it and budgeting it, it means you've got more money in the bank and therefore you borrow less. So effectively, it nets off as if you have borrowed and repaid. But Chair, I wasn't going to go into any more detail on this. It's effectively setting the borrowing limits, which are now considerably lower than they had been, but still obviously reflect the levels of borrowing in there due to investments. And we have reported more previously that if you would take those out, our net borrowing requirement is in a region of 350 to 400 million.
Thanks very much, Sean. The thing I want to start with then first of all on page 39, table 4, and I think the commentary is very useful around us not reaching the same level of capital financing requirement as if we'd been pursuing the kind of the investment strategy. I guess the bit I want to pick up in is we still seem to be picking up considerably on the totals between 2020, 21 and 22. So could you just explain to us what's driving that increase in total debt?
Yes, Chair. I mean, during this stage, there is no considerable or material reductions in investments because of the maturity periods on them. So there is no reduction due to that. This is very much reflecting the capital programme. Had we had the capital programme report before this one, one of the sections in there lists out a number of the capital projects that are currently ongoing. And Councillor Rice, for instance, raised earlier the A13, and there are a number of other schemes that are being progressed, including within the HRA. So the borrowing is the funding of the capital programme at this stage.
Thanks, Sean. And I think that's a useful clarification in terms of what those numbers represent. The other thing I just want to touch on page 39 and table 5 at the bottom. So I think we earlier on touched on capital receipts from asset sales and others. I guess just to flag to members that table doesn't quite square up, and that those totals presented are wrong. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'll apologise, Chair and members. The figures against the asset sales line and the loans repaid line are correct. I've no idea what happened to the total line. That's wrong. It should equal the equivalent of the 2 lines above. But yeah, picking up on Councillor Rice's request earlier, this is looking at projections for capital receipts. I would actually say that I think that's conservative. I think the levels will be much higher than that, but this is in line with what we've budgeted, but we won't hold ourselves just to that target.
Thanks, Sean. In terms of the progress that we're making on that kind of project to sort of deliver those asset sales, what kind of framework is that working in? So sort of what's the process for identifying, assessing, and moving ahead with a decision on particular kind of assets?
So the work taken to date, if I try and tell you that, and then also the next plans, if you like. The asset team has been going through every asset that the council owns and classifying it in one of 3 ways in the first instance. There are operational assets, and there are in the region of 60 to 70 operational assets. There are then community assets, and again, they're in the region of 50 to 60 community assets. And then there are the assets which do not fall into either of those categories. They might have been operational once, Culver Centre as an example, but aren't anymore. And there are probably at least in the region of 200 of those. But more detailed analyses have been done of the first 60 to 70 of those at this stage, and we're working through. Now, with those, that if I take one at a time first, and I'll start with those ones which don't fall under operational or community first, because that's probably the easier. What are the uses for those? First of all, we're actually reviewing those through the other directorates for any possible service need. But the biggest area, obviously challenging through there, is within the Place Directorate, when you consider any regeneration activity, when you consider the local plan and the future of sites, and also when you consider any possible house building and housing development. So we're looking at those and then determining whether we do need to keep them for future use ourselves, or if the council was going to do house building on them themselves, or whether they go for disposal. So that is a process we're running through at the moment, and that will also be spelled out whenever we take a report through. All disposals now, because of a change to the Constitution back in 2019, any disposal over 250,000 has to go through Cabinet now. So all of these will end up going through Cabinet, so it will be very, very transparent. Working back, we go to the community assets. Again, there has got to be some fundamental questions around the use of community assets. Does the council actually keep them and maintain them? Should we be looking for more community asset transfers and the like? We haven't come to that answer yet. But again, it's not necessarily with community asset transfers about getting capital receipts, to try and gain money, but more about, and it's one of the things I mentioned in response to Councillor Rice earlier, about reducing the council's exposure and liabilities going forward, really. So that's the aspect around there. We then get onto operational assets, and that's probably the more difficult. I mean, you mentioned earlier, Chair, on the last item about, people working from home. Oh, actually, it might have been Councillor Haig, sorry, as well, about working from home more and about how everything's changed. Actually, also about getting out into the community more and using the community and so on. So this is a harder piece of work, actually, about looking through all of those operational assets and trying to determine what is still needed. What are the services out from there? Should those services be provided more online now? Does it actually need a physical presence? And so on. So there is that's probably the harder category out of the three, and something which is still work in progress. I don't know if that helps, Chair.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, that's very enlightening in terms of the process. In terms of, I guess, democratic involvement in that process, presumably, is this something that will run via an ONS committee before heading through to cabinet?
I think there'll be a mix there, Chair. I think we've got some disposals going through to cabinet in February. These are considered, not very controversial, shall we say. In terms of that, it might be because there are already tenants on the site that want to actually purchase the properties, for instance. But this one's to get the ball rolling. What will also happen, though, is within there is a flow chart process being developed, for instance, for those sites that might be used for housing. And that obviously identifies the fact that it could be TRL, it could be the HRA, it could be a straight disposal to a developer, it could be a joint venture and so on. So we'll certainly bring that forward, and that is certainly something we can bring forward, whether it be this committee or Housing ONS as well as we go forward. Because, of course, Housing ONS has seen the other sites for housing development come forward, and the housing development approach as well. So that would sort of complement that. But yeah, I'm sure there will be wider democratic oversight of that than just the cabinet.
Thanks, Sean. And I guess I just wanted to sort of emphasise that point, just because I think whenever we deal with some of these issues like disposal of assets, I think they can be kind of sometimes quite controversial. I think it's really important that they go through that process at least. I don't think it necessarily has to be this ONS committee, but I think it's very important that it has that level of scrutiny and overview. So I would sort of strongly ask if we can make sure that does go through that process. I think I'll ask Councillor Ralph to come in next.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Sean. Sean, I guess it's a bit of reassurance I'm looking for at the moment. When we're talking about selling off our assets and things like that, I'm very scared when I live in Stamford and our local car park was sold off for pennies instead of like millions. Can you assure me that proper evaluation will be done on our assets and we will get what they're worth?
I'm pretty sure that when that disposal took place, somebody probably did think, we were getting what it was worth. I think that was one of the reasons as well why members and why you all as a council made the change back in 2019 to bring all disposals through the democratic process, at least those over 250,000. Any delegations to officers was removed. So even under 250, it actually goes to the leader to sign off under delegated powers. Yeah, I mean, we have a duty anyway. We have a legal duty to achieve best value for disposals, but that isn't always just about the financial amount. It can be benefits to the community as well. So I'm not talking about your particular, car park in Stamford there. So yes, I can't say anything else but the fact that we would look to get best value for all sites that come forward for disposal.
Thank you, Sean.
Thanks, Sean. Councillor Rice.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Sean, if someone wants to buy an asset, who do they write
to? They can write through to me in the first instance. So I'm the director with responsibility for the asset team. Or they can write directly into the asset team themselves.
Okay, all right. No, as I say, it's just general guidance because obviously as members, we from time to time get people talk to us and say, well, I'd like to buy so-and-so, who do we write to? And, apart from your good self, I wouldn't have a clue. Anyway, thank you for the information.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. Last question from me on this one then. So I think we've heard regular updates on the setup of the work of the investments committee. So it'd be good just to get an update as well. Clearly, there aren't any new investments coming forward as part of this sort of MTFS anymore, but clearly, there are significant existing investments that do need to be managed carefully. So I wonder if you could just give us an update on where we're at with that committee getting up and running and scrutinising that process.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. There's been 2 meetings of what we're calling the Shadow Investment Committee. I can't remember what update I provided to the last meeting, so apologies if I'm repeating stuff from the last meeting. There was an initial meeting in the last calendar year. Well, both meetings were in the last calendar year. The first one involved Councillor Hebb as the portfolio holder, and then the relevant leaders of the various parties within the council. At that meeting, we introduced the members to the name of Camdor Global, who are providing and have been for a year now various different investment advice, and they brought forward a paper as well on possible governance considerations, KPI considerations, and the like as well for investments. You'll know as well as I do that setting up a committee then comes with various rules, which includes things like democratic proportionality and the like as well. So there was then some conversation at that meeting as to whether that should be the case, or whether we should look, for having specific individuals, from the parties on there. So a different balance, if you like, and so on. The conclusion was we didn't need to rush into any decision about what that needs to look like. We can work through the next few months, see how things develop, work in a more considered pace around terms of reference and membership as well. But that same group of people could work as a shadow committee, and therefore we weren't bound under the constitution, if you like, of those various rules. So that was the first meeting. It was an introduction to everybody about the council's wider borrowing portfolios and investment portfolios. We had another meeting much closer to Christmas, I think it was in December, where we provided further updates around all of those various stats. And I did mention at a previous meeting of both standards and audit and so on, that we are seeing a couple of investments with cash flow issues, and we raised that with the members. At this point in time, I will hasten to add, because there was quite a lot of press coverage, for some reason on those, that this council has not lost any money on those investments. We are working through with the people to make sure that we maximise all of our returns still. But that is work in progress, and I'm sure you can imagine that is very commercially sensitive with those organisations, one in particular. So that was the second meeting. We are looking for another one in the next few weeks. We want to go through the capital strategy with that group of members, but we'll probably end up doing that virtually. And we can take forward some ideas now around the investment committee. I think if we go back to the investment committee when it was first voiced, and actually that was probably this meeting by yourself, Chair, last year, we were doing more investments. And so the idea of having a body cross party to scrutinise new investments, certainly, which would then lead to increased debt, etc. Obviously fitted that directly now. Is that now the right committee if we're not doing any more investments and we're actually just monitoring existing investments and their wind down? Is it still an investment committee? I'm not saying it's not, it probably is, it could still be, or could it be absorbed by one of the other committees that already has a responsibility, which could be corporate overview and scrutiny, for instance, or it could be standards and audit. Again, there are options. So we're going to take an options paper to the next meeting of that as well to see how further we develop it. I haven't. That will probably be news to some of the members on that committee. To be honest, it's the way my thought process is working, but I think it's worth talking through in the wider group, just to make sure, as part of that discussion about getting the group right.
Thanks, Sean. And clearly that group will come to their view on that. I guess I certainly take the point that the operation of that group will have a slightly different focus, considering that the new investment sort of approach has been wound down now that we're only talking about monitoring existing investments. I mean, I certainly feel that there's a very important role for that committee still to play in monitoring those investments and making sure that we've got that dedicated group overseeing them and flagging issues early in a way that committees that aren't dedicated to that purpose just cannot do. But clearly it's one for us to monitor and be interested in further updates on that work as we progress.
I'm in no way saying, Chair, just to be absolutely clear, I'm no way saying that there shouldn't be an investment committee. I just think we need to go back, take that breathing space and say things have changed. Are we all comfortable still with the direction we're taking? And it's part of that wider discussion about making sure that group or that monitoring arrangement is right. Whatever else happens, if it did go to a different committee, again, their terms of reference would have to be changed as well to make sure that that robustness and the direction that you originally wanted yourself, Chair, which was then supported by Council, is actually delivered. So that has not changed at all. Just the method of delivering it, is open for discussion, I think.
Thanks, Sean. Appreciate that. Do any other members want to comment before we go to recommendations? No. So again, the recommendation is that we've commented on the capital strategy, which I hope all members are happy that we have done.
Great.
Thank you very much. So we will move on then to the next item, which is the draft capital programme on page 59. And I think Sean, once again, will be taking us through this one.
I think it is me again, Chair. So for me, this is quite a straightforward report. So every year we obviously bring forward any new approaches, new ideas, new schemes for the capital programme. This also forms part of the council's budget setting process in February. So any schemes that come forward will come in through there. I think the most notable thing to say within this report is that it is much shorter in terms of the number of schemes than we've seen in more recent years. And that is a reflection of the general fund budget position that we talked about earlier. And actually it comes from two different directions. So first of all, and again, I've reported this to previous meetings of this committee, we have reviewed the capital programme this year, and we've deferred a number of the schemes there, which weren't essential or weren't considered essential. The reason for that in the first instance was to again reduce down the overall borrowing costs and levels of debt that would be required to fund them. And you yourself, Chair, raised that you highlighted that level of debt still going up despite that, in the previous report. So we've already done that as a reduction. The other thing before we move into next year, just to point out again, and again it comes back to now the general fund budget report, all of these schemes require a group of people to deliver them. It's not just, if it's a highway scheme, it's not just highways. If it's a regeneration scheme, it's not just regen. There's procurement, there is the asset team, there's legal, there's finance. They are all cross-departmental groups. And what we're seeing is there is going to be a reduction in overall resources. We talked about the vacant posts. So when I'm talking resources now, I'm talking people. And so the ability, the capacity to deliver significant numbers of schemes now is also reducing. And I think we have to recognise that, as part of this process. So what you see now in terms of the schemes coming forward, there's two aspects. There is the, hopefully all members will remember, when you look at paragraph 4.2 or the table in 4.2, that one of the things we did to save, identifying a £20,000 boiler repair here and a £30,000 lift repair there, was we put a number of those smaller schemes into pots which were classed as service review, which is to help transformation, digital, which is keeping our existing ICT structure going, but also implementing new ICT processes. We're launching a new online facility and so on. And obviously property, which is all of those things that I was just mentioning, if you talk about boilers and lifts and the like and so on as well, roofs and so on. So that is an amalgamation of a lot of smaller numbers of things coming forward, but a number of them. What we've then done over the last years, and it's reflected here, and this is the bit which is certainly smaller, is in Appendix 2, we've brought forward some of the larger individual schemes. And we are going back to the times when we're maybe not being so adventurous, when the number of schemes aren't as long and as high value as they had previously been. So there are some schemes here coming forward and being put forward for consideration, and subject to your comments and then Cabinet's approval in February. These would then go on to Council at the end of February as part of the budget setting report. I think that's all I need to say at the moment, Chair, on this. It's quite straightforward. It's more the impact, I think, of the previous reports we've already seen.
Thanks very much, Sean. I guess the first point to just raise on this one is around affordability of the capital projects and managing the budget. So I don't remember if you were on one of the recent planning, transport and regeneration ONS committees. I think we were discussing the Grays Town Centre underpass, and one of the points that I highlighted in that meeting was that each of the design options that had been brought forward had been scored as not meeting the kind of the budget and cost requirements of the project, and yet still kind of it did go forward. So I guess the question is, in terms of the kind of the central controls on these projects, making sure that we are making good decisions on affordability in kind of project design up front. How confident are we that we're kind of really quite strong on that level of oversight and control? Sorry, Sean, I think you're on mute.
Apologies, first time tonight. Certainly over the last year, project management has considerably improved, I think, from where we'd been before. We're making sure that we get the right people on it. There is a greater level of higher involvement, more senior involvement across the board. We have a major projects board chaired by the chief executive, of which a number of senior directors are on as well, where we go through all of those schemes on a monthly basis, the higher level schemes, etc., to challenge both affordability, delivery, timescales and problems and the like. There is something about local authorities, though, Chair, which has issues with original budgets and estimates, and it's not just Thurrock. It's wherever we worked before, and it happens within the public sector. Actually, you've only got to look at central government schemes as well, where there are always significant cost overruns. I'm not sure we're ever going to get away from that. I don't know how you get away from that. But what I can say is that the controls around the projects that are now coming forward, we have got a far more improved project management process in place.
Okay, thanks, Sean. I guess it's an area that we'll watch with interest over the next couple of years, and clearly continue to be a focus in terms of ensuring that we're getting the right outcomes through these capital projects. Councillor Ralph.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks again, Sean, for your third report tonight. I just wanted to pick up on something. The Stamford Hope train station, is it down here as the interchange? Is it? I think it's correct. Obviously, I'm aware that over the period of time, we did have a bit of an issue with funding or contributions that are allowed to come from DP World. Did we hold them to those funds? Did we actually claim them off of them?
there's been a number of contributions from DP World for different schemes. My understanding is yes, we've received that funding from memory, but I'd probably need to come back to you because I don't want to absolutely confirm that here and then find I'm confusing myself with a different scheme. I believe it's the case, but I will come back to the committee, Chair, if that's okay with you.
I just think obviously with we're looking, as you say, projects that overrun or go out of funding. If there is an opportunity for contributions from other third parties, then we're making sure that we are claiming them. So yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah, we are. I'm positive that I can be as positive as I can be that we are claiming, and if we haven't claimed it yet, then we're in the process because it hasn't been the time to claim it. That we will do that. But certainly we are absolutely looking to maximise contributions from wherever we can.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Councillor Ralph, for an important point. Councillor Rice.
Oh, thank you, Chair. Sean, when we talk about the Stamford-le-Hope interchange, going through various papers, etc., I understand we've spent something like £9 million to date on consultants. Are we anywhere near getting a design so that we can actually get on and deliver this project? It's very concerning that we've spent this level of money and we don't seem to be any way forward.
Chair, Councillor Rice, I absolutely don't recognise £9 million worth of consultants on Stamford-le-Hope. I just don't recognise that figure. So I think, again, the best thing I can do is come back to the committee with a written answer on that, setting out what we have done on consultants and so on, and actually just getting you that brief update on the current position of the scheme.
Yeah, that would be most helpful. And on the A13, I know I keep coming on to this. We've obviously got a £30 million overspend. How will we actually square that so that it doesn't have such an impact on the authority?
Chair, I'm going to answer this question in the same way as I've answered it here before at Standards and Audit before and at PTR before. Ultimately, the £30 million, current projected overspend, or any overspend on this scheme or any other scheme, the council is contracted to pay that money. That's the first point I think we have to be clear on. So we're contracted to do that. Works that we're carrying out at the moment to actually try and mitigate that. One is obviously try and reduce down any overspend as far as we possibly can. And there are considerable challenges going in to Kiers in terms of monthly claims. The second is very much looking for other third-party contributions. Councillor Ralph just made that comment himself, but we are looking at other contributions. So, for instance, going back to CELEP about support around COVID impacts on the scheme. That's an example, but always also the Highways Agency, government departments, and the like. And the third one, which again we've mentioned before, but I won't go into detail on, is looking at a number of the advisors that we've used in the first instance around this scheme, and just checking back on those. So the last resort will be that we would need to use prudential borrowing. But all of those other things would happen before that. And again, we touched on, in answer to your question around capital receipts, Councillor Rice, earlier, capital receipts would go in as well to fund the capital expenditure wherever we could, because that way we're not having to prudentially borrow and therefore create a revenue liability.
Yeah, very good. And on the A13, the eastbound slip road, which you've got on page 61, I mean, I understood that was a Highways England scheme. How much money have we actually committed to that today?
We've not committed very much at all. I can't actually tell you the figure off the top of my head. Where we are at the moment is on feasibility. The council could and this would be a council decision, obviously, as part of the capital programme. The council could take on the east-facing slip works to be able to do that. There is significant government grants that would actually be able to come in and support that as well. So the council could do that, as opposed to it being a Highways England scheme. And it seems to be being suggested, my understanding is that that's the most likely way, but this is from Highways England, of getting that delivered. That said, I'll now sit here with my accounting hat on and say, well, any scheme of that size, be it delivered by Thurrock Council or any other local authority, or even the national bodies themselves in terms of government and Highways England, you know, we commented earlier about the cost overruns and the pressures on any of those schemes as well anyway.
Yes.
So there would most definitely be a risk, and if it was brought forward past this feasibility stage for members to consider it, then we would be making sure that all of those financial risks were recognised.
Thank you very much, Sean.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Councillor Rice. Sean, final question from me. Clearly, we've talked a lot about the impact of COVID on the general fund budget. Presumably, there was also quite a big impact in terms of the capital programme as well. Is this something that we're seeing really having a major impact on our plans, or is it something that we won't feel so much going forwards?
Not at the moment. It has impacted the A13, hence the fact we were able to go to CELEP, and that is a process we're going through to be able to do it. Other ways you can argue that there has been a benefit, because there has been some major highways works already in the last few months within Thurrock on major schemes around Junction 31, for instance, which we've been able to do with less traffic on the road. Whereas in normal circumstances, that would have been, very, very difficult and even more disruptive than it would have been. So no, we're not necessarily seeing it across the board at the moment. But when it comes through to tendering any further works, only time will tell as to whether there are any other lasting impacts, I think.
Thanks, Sean. Do any members want to make any further comments, or can we move to recommendations? Okay. Once again, recommendation at 1.1 is that we comment on the proposals. Again, all members happy that we've made the comments that we need to on all of these proposals.
Agreed.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we'll move on then to the final item on the agenda, item 9, the work programme, page 73 on the agendas. Couple of points that are consequential from what we've discussed today, just to add. So first of all, for the next municipal year, we should just add the communication strategy penciled in for the June meeting. Sean, I think it'd be helpful as well if there is a substantive update to give, to come back with a further financial update in the March meeting, so we can continue to monitor where we are on progress against budget.
Yeah, happy to do that, Chair.
Thanks. Do any other members have anything that they'd like to comment on or note about the work programme? Councillor Duffin?
Yeah, I think just because there was quite a few questions earlier, not around so much the investments as we've discussed before, but around commercialisation might be something good to bring back. It suddenly dawned on me when I saw June that is next political year. So no, but whether that's June or September, I think having something on commercialisation, even if it says not investments within it, because I don't want it to turn into a discussion on investments, but discussion around wider commercialisation, I think is something worth discussing.
Yeah, I think that's certainly a good idea. I think we had, I can't remember if it was this year or last, that we had the commercialisation strategy penciled in. I think it was pushed back. So I think I certainly agree it's important to get that on the agenda in the future to make sure that we do come back to that. Sean?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I need to look. I'm not sure whether the capital receipts and asset disposals falls under this committee, because it is a wider issue, which means it could. But then again, does assets fall under, I don't know, any of the other committees? I'm not sure. But I'm taking your point from earlier about the transparency and the democratic oversight around disposals. So it's probably worth bringing an update, and I'm quite happy to bring it to this committee in March, actually, just very much an oversight of what we're doing, what I explained verbally earlier, and more of an update around that.
Thanks, Sean. I think that would be, yeah, I think that'd be really useful for this committee to have sight of. Any other items to bring forward? No. Okay. Thank you very much then. And with that, I'll just thank all members and officers for attending this evening. Quite a long session, but comprehensive, and I think really important in terms of the topics that we were covering. So thank you all for bearing with us this evening. And with that, I'll wish you all a good night, and I will see you at the next meeting in March.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, members.
Cheers.